because he's the chief analyst at LIGNET.com. He's Fred Fleitz. Fred, we welcome you back to America's Forum.
Good to be here, JD.
Fred, we look back at history, and there's been an on and off relationship between the Russians and the Chinese. I think back to the 1950s. We talked about then Sino-Soviet relations, Nikita Khrushchev, Mao Zedong. We take a look in the late 1960s, early 1970s, actual border clashes between the Soviets and the Chinese. And it's just been very interesting to see. And now this renaissance in their relationship, if you will. It's not that they were thawed into a situation like a diplomatic ice age, but still this is interesting to see this influx of, or this invitation for an influx of Chinese capital. What kind of deal is Putin trying to strike, and who has the leverage in this situation?
These are all great questions, JD, and I would add that under the surface there are still major differences. Economic, political differences over energy, differences over Siberia, and China eyeing possibly taking part of Siberia in the distant future. But at the end of the day, what's going on here is that Russia and China have a common concern, and that is the United States. And both of them are concerned about the U.S. intervening in their sphere of influence. They both don't like what's going on in Ukraine because they're concerned that the U.S. and the European Union are pushing for intervention in Ukraine, and that's something that China has always been very worried about. They veto any effort to have intervention in another state. So I think they're cooperating here, but the real reason is they have a common interest, and that is opposing the United States.
So this is an alliance of convenience, but in the connivance category. You know, Fred, I was talking to Pete Hoekstra about this earlier, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the rules of investment for American companies in China include ceding majority interest to the Chinese, or that economic agency within the Chinese Red Army that controls all these deals. So they have majority interest. Now, I'm just wondering, with Putin in a situation where he wants to get his hands on cash, do the Chinese get a better end of the deal? In other words, will Putin try to impose on the Chinese the kind of investment structure that the Chinese have imposed on foreign investors in their own country?
The Russian rules on investment haven't been as strict as the rules that the Chinese have laid down. And China can demand these conditions because their market is huge and it's growing. Russia doesn't have that. It's an entirely different situation. Russia put some pretty tough conditions on oil companies trying to invest in those resources. But the rules that Russia may put down on China for investing in other industries, it's hard to believe they would be anywhere as strict as what China lays down, simply because Russia's desperate for the cash and there aren't other companies beating down the door to invest.
Fred, we take a look at the Chinese geopolitically. We see the move made now, the concern that the Chinese are really looking to become the world's preeminent superpower by the mid-century mark, that you have a situation where the Chinese have a presence in the Western Hemisphere, have a presence in the Southern Hemisphere, for example, in Central and South America, have worked really geopolitically to seek energy and natural resources, not only in Central America but in Africa. And did this offer from Putin come to the Chinese as a pleasant surprise, given where they have concentrated their interests heretofore geopolitically?
I think for China it's a pleasant surprise, but it's consistent with China's efforts to spread its economic interests around the world. And you're exactly right. China has substantial interest in Africa and Venezuela. And China has an advantage. Chinese companies have an advantage over Western companies that they will invest anywhere. They have investments in Sudan, in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela, unstable countries where Western companies won't go. The Chinese don't care about human rights violations. They simply want to have a presence there, and they take a long-term view. They will lose money for a long time because they want to get their hands on natural resources.
Fred Fleitz, you made mention of a kind of tension below the surface that remains historically. It was made manifest in that border dispute in the late 60s, early 70s between the then Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. But last week, we received word that the Russians, as part of their sanctions against the United States over the Ukraine, were going to quit selling rocket engines to the United States. And what was it, earlier this week, we heard that the Russians were basically going to restrict American access to the International Space Station, a space station that American taxpayers basically bought and paid for and helped to build. Now, we've seen a Chinese move into space. Is it conceivable that we might see some, for lack of a better term, interstellar cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese to move together to take the next steps in space exploration, again at the expense of the United States in terms of national prestige and national security?
If the current downturn in relations between the United States and Russia continues, I think there's some possibility of that. But Chinese technology is so far behind the United States, it certainly wouldn't be in Russia's interest to try to strike an alliance with China. I actually think U.S.-Russia relations will improve, and Russia's going to start selling rocket engines to us again and end this threat of not providing space lift to the space station. But in the meantime, I think the United States is pretty determined that we're going to regain our capacity to build rocket engines. We can't be dependent on the Russians to provide them.
Well, we take a look at this situation, and obviously there are so many concerns about what so many of us feel to be a lack of vision in terms of American foreign policy, and a notion where it's almost as if the Blame America First crowd has policy ascendancy now in terms of our national security apparatus in Washington, D.C. Fred, I know the focus has been China and Russia heretofore, but I just need to get your comment on something else involving the Russians having to do with the Ukraine. As I understand now, again perhaps signaling both Putin's need for cash and the leverage he enjoys over the Ukraine. Perhaps it was inevitable, but as I understand it, monitoring press reports, the official pronouncement has gone out that henceforth Ukraine will have to pay in cash for the fuel, both the natural gas and the other petroleum products it receives from Gazprom. Is this Putin again tightening the screws on the Ukraine?
This is not the first time the Russians made such a demand since the uprising in Ukraine earlier in the year. But it's pretty appalling that Russia made this demand after these extremely destabilizing referendums that took place in eastern Ukraine over the weekend. Putin is really tightening the screws on Ukraine to make it clear to them that if they're going to have a political future, they're going to have to be under the thumb of Moscow.
When you take a look at Putin, is there any single word that best describes him as a leader?
I think he's pretty decisive, and he knows what he wants.
Decisive, a diplomatic term from a man who monitors intelligence and offers his analysis and his assessments for LIGNET.com. Fred Fleitz, as always, we appreciate your insights, and we thank you for explaining more about what has transpired between Russia and China and what may yet be in store for both those nations as well as our own. Thanks very much.
Good to be here.
Now, we'd invite you to stay with us. When we come back, we'll have our special weekly segment, Political Potluck. You don't want to miss that, so we want you to hang around for it. Also, we invite you to weigh in on the stories we've been discussing today. 3 ways via social media. You can tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, hashtag America's Forum. You can also email us. Our address is connect@newsmaxtv.com. And there is Facebook, where you can metaphorically help us face the music. The address there, facebook.com/Newsmax. Somebody say back. We're coming right back.